The thug's slap still echoed in the diner when the door burst open. Stephen Curtis stepped in with his men, eyes locking on the red handprint burning across his father's face. The room froze as the Mafia boss took one slow step forward, every inch of him promising violence so cold it made the windows tremble. And when Stephen whispered, "Who touched my father?" the thug realized too late he hadn't just slapped an old man. He'd declared war. But what Stephen does next, no one in that diner will ever forget. If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it. Alright, back to the story. The Ridgewood diner smelled of fresh coffee and bacon grease that morning, the kind of familiar comfort that made the world feel steady. Warm light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the red vinyl booths and checkered floor. The jukebox in the corner sat silent, and the only sounds were the soft clink of ceramic mugs and the occasional scrape of a fork against a plate. At his usual corner booth sat Henry Curtis, an 81-year-old Army veteran who arrived every morning at precisely 8:10. Rain or shine, summer or winter. For the past 12 years, this booth had been his anchor, his routine, the one constant in a life that had seen too much change. He wore a plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, the fabric soft and faded from countless washes. His work boots, scuffed and worn, had walked through decades most people only read about in history books. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup of black coffee to his lips, a tremor that came with age, not fear. But his eyes, though creased with deep lines and shadowed by exhaustion, still held the quiet strength of a man who had once served his country with honor. Henry hadn't spoken to his son, Stephen Curtis, in years. Their relationship had shattered long ago when Stephen became deeply entangled with organized crime, leaving Henry heartbroken and terrified for his son's soul. He had tried everything, pleading, reasoning, even ultimatums, but Stephen had chosen a path Henry couldn't follow. And eventually, Henry had been forced to make the hardest decision of his life. He cut ties. He still thought about Stephen every day, wondered if he was safe, wondered if he was even alive. But those thoughts belonged to another time, another version of himself. This morning, Henry simply wanted his coffee, his quiet booth, and a few moments of peace before the world demanded anything more from him. That peace shattered without warning. Across the diner, a young man in dark clothes had been arguing with the waitress over his bill. He was broad-shouldered and heavily tattooed, with a neck thick as a tree trunk and eyes that burned with barely contained rage. His voice climbed louder with each passing second, his anger more volatile, drawing nervous glances from other customers. "I ain't paying for this garbage," he snarled, jabbing a finger at the check. "You trying to rip me off?" The waitress, a kind woman in her 50s named Diane, stepped back with her hands raised. "Sir, please, it's just the price on the menu. I didn't—" "Don't tell me what it is," he barked, slamming his palm on the counter. Henry watched quietly from his booth, his expression calm but his heart heavy. He had seen men like this before, men who mistook volume for power, cruelty for strength. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. He simply observed, his steady gaze reflecting a lifetime of experience that couldn't be intimidated. The thug turned mid-rant and caught Henry's eyes on him. Something about that look, the old veteran's unflinching, quiet stare, ignited a fire in the young man's wounded ego. He saw judgment in those eyes, saw disapproval, saw everything he hated about authority, about discipline, about men who had earned their respect instead of demanding it. Before anyone could move, before anyone could breathe, the thug crossed the diner in 3 strides and slapped Henry hard across the face. The crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. Silverware clattered onto plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman near the window gasped and covered her mouth, and Henry, his weathered cheek burning red, slowly raised his hand to his face not from pain, but from the deep sorrow of realizing how far the world had fallen. He didn't cry out, didn't curse, didn't retaliate. He simply sat there, stunned, his calloused fingers pressed gently against the bruise already blooming beneath his skin. If seeing an elderly man treated with such cruelty breaks your heart even a little, don't scroll past without subscribing. Every click helps shine a light on stories that remind the world what real respect looks like. The diner fell into suffocating silence. Diane stood frozen behind the counter, her order pad trembling in her hands. Other customers stared at their plates, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes, too frightened to intervene. The thug stood over Henry for a moment, chest heaving, fists still clenched, waiting for anyone to challenge him. No one did. Satisfied, he turned and swaggered back to his table, muttering under his breath about old men who don't know when to mind their business. Henry remained motionless in his booth, his hand still pressed to his cheek, his coffee growing cold in front of him. He had survived boot camp, combat zones, and decades of hard labor. Physical pain meant nothing to him anymore, but his heart ached at what he witnessed. A world that had forgotten honor, forgotten the meaning of respect for those who had paved the way. Minutes crawled by like hours. Henry stayed seated, partly because his legs felt too heavy to carry him out, and partly because this diner had been his sanctuary for so long he didn't know where else to go. What no one in that diner knew, what even Henry couldn't have predicted, was that in less than 60 seconds, the bell above the door would ring, and everything would change. The bell above the diner door chimed. It was a soft sound, delicate, even the same cheerful jingle that announced every customer who walked through those glass doors. But this time, the sound cut through the tension like a blade, and every head in the diner turned instinctively toward the entrance. 3 men stepped inside. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had been tailored to his exact measurements. His white shirt was open at the collar, revealing dark tattoos that crawled up his neck like vines. His hair was slicked back, his jaw sharp and clean-shaven, and his eyes cold, calculating, and unnervingly calm swept across the diner with the precision of a predator assessing its territory. Behind him came 2 more men, both built like linebackers, their arms thick with muscle and ink. They wore dark jackets despite the warmth of the morning, and their expressions were unreadable, carved from stone. They didn't need to speak. Their presence alone commanded attention, demanded submission, radiated danger. The diner, already silent from the earlier violence, somehow grew even quieter. Diane's hand flew to her chest. A man near the counter slowly set down his fork. His appetite vanished. The thug who had slapped Henry glanced up from his table, his sneer faltering for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. The tall man in the suit, Stephen Curtis, stood in the doorway for a moment, his gaze moving methodically from table to table, booth to booth. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for someone, and then his eyes found Henry. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Stephen's expression flickered just for an instant with something raw and unguarded. Shock, recognition. And then, as his gaze dropped to the red handprint blazing across his father's weathered cheek, something darker surfaced. Rage. Not the loud, reckless kind that the thug had displayed earlier. This was different. This was the kind of fury that burned cold, that moved with purpose, that didn't need to announce itself because everyone in the room could feel it like a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Stephen's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, slowly curled into fists. His eyes never left his father's face. Behind him, his 2 men exchanged a glance. They didn't need orders. They knew. Whatever was about to happen, they were ready. Stephen began walking. Each step was deliberate, controlled, his polished shoes clicking softly against the diner's tile floor. He moved like a man who had all the time in the world, but also like a man who could unleash hell in an instant if he chose to. Customers pressed themselves back into their booths. Diane retreated behind the counter. The thug, still seated at his table, finally seemed to realize that something was very, very wrong. His bravado flickered. His eyes darted toward the exit, then back to Stephen, then to his 2 companions flanking the door. The men weren't blocking the way, not yet, but their positioning was deliberate. They stood like sentries, silent and immovable, their arms crossed over their chests. No one was leaving. Stephen reached Henry's booth and stopped. For a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other. Henry's hand was still pressed to his bruised cheek, his eyes wide with disbelief. He hadn't seen Stephen in years, hadn't heard his voice, hadn't known if he was even still alive. And now here he was, standing in the middle of the Ridgewood diner, dressed like a man who ruled the underworld, looking at Henry like he was the only person in the room. Stephen's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, barely above a whisper. "Dad." The word hung in the air like a ghost. Henry's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. His eyes burned with emotion he couldn't name: relief, fear, pride, heartbreak, all tangled together in a knot too complicated to unravel. Stephen's gaze dropped again to the bruise. His expression hardened, the coldness returning to his eyes as he turned his head slowly toward the rest of the diner. "Who touched my father?" His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was a weight to it, a gravity that made the question feel less like an inquiry and more like a sentencing. No one answered. The thug shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence evaporating like steam. He glanced toward the door again, but Stephen's men hadn't moved. They simply watched, their faces blank, their eyes sharp. Stephen took one step away from the booth, his hands still at his sides, his posture relaxed but radiating controlled menace. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. His presence alone was enough to make grown men shrink. "I'll ask one more time," Stephen said softly, his eyes scanning the room. "Who put their hands on my father?" The diner held its breath, and in the corner booth, Henry Curtis sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, watching his estranged son, the boy he had raised, the man he had lost, stand between him and the world like a wall of steel. Stephen wasn't just a mafia boss in that moment. He was a son, and someone was about to pay. Stephen stood in the center of the diner, waiting. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Every second that passed without an answer seemed to darken his expression further, his patience thinning with each breath. But beneath that cold exterior, memories flickered through his mind, like old film reels, images he had tried for years to bury. He remembered being 7 years old, small and scrappy, coming home with a black eye after defending a kid at school. Henry had sat him down at their kitchen table, placed a bag of frozen peas against his face, and said quietly, "Fighting isn't about being the toughest, son. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves." He remembered being 15, angry and reckless, getting arrested for the first time. Henry had picked him up from the police station without a word, driven him home in silence, and then only then asked, "Is this who you want to be?" He remembered being 23, standing in their living room with blood on his knuckles and darkness in his eyes, telling his father he was done pretending to be something he wasn't. Henry had looked at him with tears streaming down his face and whispered, "Then I can't watch you destroy yourself. I love you too much for that." That was the last conversation they'd had, 7 years ago. 7 years of silence, of distance, of pretending he didn't care. And now, seeing his father sitting in that booth with a fresh bruise on his weathered face, Stephen realized he had been lying to himself the entire time. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the diner until it landed on the thug still seated, still trying to maintain his tough guy posture, but with sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Stephen didn't rush. He crossed the diner with measured steps, his men shifting positions subtly to block any possible escape route. When he reached the thug's table, he stopped and looked down at him with an expression that revealed nothing. "Stand up," Stephen said quietly. The thug hesitated, his jaw clenched, his pride warring with his survival instinct. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse, but then Stephen's men moved closer, just a single step, and the message was clear. Slowly, reluctantly, the thug stood. Up close, Stephen could see the bravado crumbling. The young man was scared, trying desperately not to show it, but his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "You slapped an old man," Stephen said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "You slapped my father." The thug tried to muster defiance. He was staring at me like, "I don't care," Stephen interrupted, his tone never rising. "I don't care what you thought he did. I don't care what excuse you've invented in your head. You put your hands on an 81-year-old veteran who was sitting quietly in a booth, drinking his coffee, minding his own business." The thug's mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. Stephen leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're going to apologize, and then you're going to leave. And if I ever hear that you've been within 10 miles of this diner again, we're going to have a very different conversation. Do you understand me?" The young man nodded frantically, his earlier arrogance completely shattered. "I didn't hear you," Stephen said. "Yes," the thug croaked. "Yes, I understand." "Good." Stephen stepped back, gesturing toward Henry's booth. "Now apologize." The thug stumbled forward, his legs unsteady, until he stood before Henry. He couldn't meet the old man's eyes. I'm sorry," he muttered. "I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Henry said nothing. He simply looked at the young man with those tired, dignified eyes, not with hatred, not with satisfaction, but with something that looked almost like pity. Stephen nodded once. "Get out." The thug didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran for the door, shoving it open so hard the bell jangled violently. Within seconds, he was gone, disappearing down the street like a shadow fleeing the light. The diner remained frozen, everyone watching as Stephen turned back toward his father's booth. And then, in a gesture that shocked every single person in that room, Stephen Curtis feared Mafia boss, ruthless enforcer, a man whose name made hardened criminals nervous, knelt down beside his father. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at Henry, really looked at him, taking in every line on his face, every gray hair, every sign of the years they'd lost. "Dad," Stephen said quietly, his voice cracking slightly on the word, "I didn't know you still came here." Henry's hand dropped from his cheek, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Stephen," he whispered, "I didn't expect, not after everything. I should have been here," Stephen said, his jaw tight with emotion. "I should have been better." For a moment, neither man spoke. The weight of their broken relationship hung in the air between them, all the angry words, all the slammed doors, all the years of silence and regret. Henry reached out with a trembling hand and placed it on Stephen's shoulder. "You're here now," he said softly. Stephen closed his eyes, and for just a second, he looked like a boy again, lost, hurting, desperate for his father's approval. Around them, the diner slowly began to breathe again. But in that corner booth, time had stopped. A father and son, separated by choices and consequences, were finally in the same room again, and neither one knew what came next. Stephen remained kneeling beside his father for a long moment, his hand resting on the edge of the booth, his eyes still fixed on that angry red mark across Henry's cheek. The bruise had deepened in color, spreading like spilled wine across weathered skin. Around them, the diner had begun to stir, whispers floating between tables, the soft clink of silverware resuming, people pretending to return to their meals while stealing glances at the corner booth where a Mafia boss knelt before his father like a penitent son. Diane approached cautiously with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands steadier now. "Can I get you gentlemen anything?" she asked softly. Stephen looked up at her, and his expression softened slightly. "Coffee, black, and whatever my father wants." "I'm fine, Diane," Henry said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of exhaustion. She nodded and poured Stephen a cup before retreating, leaving father and son alone again in their fragile bubble of reconciliation. Stephen slid into the booth across from Henry, his broad frame somehow looking smaller in that moment, less like the dangerous man who had walked through the door, and more like the son who had left home 7 years ago. "How long has it been since someone looked after you?" Stephen asked, his eyes searching his father's face. Henry managed a weak smile. "I look after myself just fine." "Dad," Stephen's voice carried gentle reproach, "you're 81 years old, sitting alone in a diner, and some punk thinks he can put hands on you without consequences." "I didn't need rescuing," Henry said, though there was no anger in his words, just the stubborn pride of a man who had survived decades by refusing to be anyone's victim. "I know you didn't," Stephen replied. "But that doesn't mean you should have to sit here and take it." Henry's fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, and he stared into the dark liquid as if it might hold answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "You've changed," he said finally. "The clothes, the men following you, the way people look at you. I'm still your son. Are you?" Henry's eyes lifted, meeting Stephen's gaze directly. "Because the boy I raised wouldn't have men with guns standing at the door. The boy I raised wouldn't walk into a room and make people afraid." Stephen flinched as if struck, but he didn't look away. "No," he said quietly. "He wouldn't. But that boy didn't survive, Dad. The world took him apart piece by piece, and what's left is this. And you think I'm proud of that? I think you're sitting here with a bruise on your face because you have no one watching your back," Stephen said, his voice harder now. "I think you spent 7 years pretending I didn't exist because you couldn't accept who I became. And I think that whatever I am now, whatever choices I made, I'm still the only person in this entire city who would burn it to the ground if someone hurt you." The words hung between them like smoke. Henry's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell Stephen that violence wasn't protection, that power built on fear was worthless. But looking at his son across the table, this man who commanded respect and terror in equal measure, he saw something else too. He saw the little boy who used to hold his hand crossing the street. He saw the teenager who stayed up all night when Henry had pneumonia, too worried to sleep. He saw his son. "I never stopped loving you," Henry said, his voice breaking. "Even when I told you to leave, even when I said I couldn't watch you destroy yourself. I never stopped." Stephen's jaw clenched, and he looked away quickly, blinking hard. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I stayed away because I thought it would keep you safe. I thought if I wasn't around, my life wouldn't touch yours." "And how did that work out?" Henry asked, gesturing to his bruised cheek with a bitter smile. Despite everything, Stephen huffed a short, humorless laugh. "Not well, apparently." They sat in silence for a moment, the chasm of 7 years slowly beginning to narrow, not closed, not healed, but narrowing. Stephen's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened instantly. "What is it?" Henry asked. "The guy who hit you," Stephen said, his thumb moving across the screen. "He's talking. My people are hearing things." "Let him talk," Henry said. He ran. "It's over. It's not over until I say it's over." Stephen's voice carried the cold edge of authority that made men twice his size back down. "He put hands on you, Dad. That doesn't just go away because he mumbled an apology." "Stephen." "No." Stephen stood, his full height and presence filling the booth area. "I let him walk out of here with his legs still working. That was mercy. But if he's out there running his mouth, telling people he can disrespect you without consequences, then we have a problem." Henry recognized that look in his son's eyes, the same look Stephen had worn as a teenager right before a fight, the look that said the decision was already made and no amount of reasoning would change it. "What are you going to do?" Henry asked quietly. Stephen pulled out his wallet, dropped $200 bills on the table, and looked at his father with an expression that was equal parts love and ruthlessness. "What I should have been doing all along," he said. "I'm going to make sure no one ever touches you again." Stephen didn't leave immediately. He stood beside the booth for a long moment, his phone still in his hand, his jaw set with that familiar determination Henry had seen countless times before, the same look Stephen wore as a child when he'd decided something was right. Consequences be damned. But then Henry spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Sit down, son." Stephen hesitated, caught between the man he had become and the boy who still, somewhere deep inside, wanted his father's approval. "Please," Henry added, and that single word carried more weight than any command. Slowly, Stephen slid back into the booth, pocketing his phone. His men, still positioned near the door, remained motionless, waiting for instructions that didn't come. Diane appeared again, this time with a plate of toast and eggs she set in front of Henry without asking. "On the house?" she said softly, her eyes moving between father and son with something that looked like hope. "Thank you, Diane," Henry said. She nodded and retreated once more, leaving them in their bubble of fragile peace. Henry picked up his fork but didn't eat. Instead, he looked at his son, really looked at him, taking in the expensive suit, the tattoos crawling up his neck, the hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there 7 years ago. "When did you start dressing like that?" Henry asked, gesturing to Stephen's suit. Stephen glanced down at himself, almost surprised. "A few years ago. Image matters in my line of work." "Your line of work," Henry repeated, the words tasting bitter. "That's what we're calling it now? What would you prefer I call it, Dad? My criminal enterprise? My organization?" Stephen's voice carried an edge of defensiveness. "I'm not pretending to be something I'm not." "No," Henry said quietly. "You never did that. Even as a kid, you wore your heart on your sleeve. When you were angry, everyone knew. When you were hurt, you couldn't hide it." Stephen's expression flickered with something vulnerable. "People see that as weakness now." "Is it?" Henry asked, his eyes searching his son's face. "Or is pretending you don't feel anything the real weakness?" The question hung in the air between them. Stephen picked up his coffee cup, then set it down without drinking. His hands scarred across the knuckles, marked with ink, rested on the table like weapons at rest. "You cut me out of your life," he said finally, his voice low. "You told me that if I kept going down this path, I couldn't be your son anymore." Henry flinched. "I said I couldn't watch you destroy yourself. That's different." "Is it?" Stephen echoed Henry's earlier question back at him. "Because from where I was standing, it felt pretty permanent." "I was terrified," Henry admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Every time my phone rang, I thought it would be the police telling me you were dead. Every time I saw the news, I looked for your name. I couldn't just sit there and watch you throw your life away. So you threw me away instead." "No." Henry reached across the table, his trembling hand covering Stephen's scarred one. "I never threw you away. I prayed for you every single night. I kept your picture in my wallet. I asked people about you, made sure you were still alive." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I never stopped being your father, Stephen. I didn't know how to save you." Stephen stared at their hands, his father's weathered and shaking, his own marked by violence and choices that couldn't be undone. "I didn't need saving, Dad. I needed you to trust that I could make my own decisions, even if they weren't the ones you wanted me to make." "Trust you to become this?" Henry gestured around them, at the men by the door, at the expensive suit, at everything Stephen had become. "Trust me to survive," Stephen corrected. The world isn't kind to people like us, Dad. You taught me that. You taught me to fight for what matters, to protect people who can't protect themselves. That's exactly what I'm doing. By breaking the law? By hurting people? By making sure my people are fed, housed, and protected, Stephen said, his voice gaining strength. By making sure neighborhoods stay safe, because everyone knows there are consequences for preying on the weak. By building something that matters, even if it's not what you wanted for me. Henry was silent for a long moment, his hand still resting on Stephen's. Finally, he spoke. Do you sleep at night? The question caught Stephen off guard. What? Do you sleep? Henry repeated. Or do the choices you've made keep you awake? Stephen's jaw tightened. He wanted to lie. Wanted to say he slept fine, that he had no regrets. But this was his father. And somehow, even after 7 years, he couldn't bring himself to lie to those tired, knowing eyes. Some nights are harder than others, he admitted quietly. Henry nodded slowly, as if that answer told him everything he needed to know. Then you're still my son, he said. Because the day you sleep soundly after hurting innocent people is the day I'll know I've truly lost you. Stephen's throat tightened. He looked away, blinking hard, fighting against emotions he'd spent years learning to bury. I've missed you, Dad, he whispered. I know, Henry said, his own eyes glistening. I've missed you too. Around them, the diner continued its morning rhythm. But in that corner booth, 2 broken pieces were slowly beginning to fit back together. They sat in that booth for another hour, the coffee growing cold, the eggs untouched, the world outside the window continuing while time seemed suspended between them. Stephen leaned back against the vinyl seat, his eyes distant as memories surfaced. Memories he'd spent years trying to drown in work, in power, in the constant motion that kept him from thinking too deeply about what he'd lost. Do you remember the night Mom died? Stephen asked suddenly. Henry's breath caught. They never talked about Sarah, not in the 7 years before their falling out, and certainly not in the silence that followed. Every day, Henry said quietly. I was 16, Stephen continued, his voice hollow. And I remember standing in that hospital hallway, watching you hold her hand while the machines beeped slower and slower. You told her everything would be okay. You told her we'd be fine. I believed it, Henry said, his voice thick with old grief. But we weren't fine, were we? Stephen's eyes met his father's. You worked 3 jobs trying to keep us afloat. You were never home. And I was angry at the world, angry at God, angry at you for making promises you couldn't keep. Henry's hands trembled more violently now. I did the best I could. I know that now, Stephen said. But back then, I just felt abandoned. First Mom, then you, not because you wanted to leave, but because you had to work yourself half to death just to keep the lights on. The memories flooded back to Henry coming home at midnight to find Stephen with a black eye, coming home at 2 a.m. to find him not home at all, the fights, the screaming matches, the slow, terrible realization that he was losing his son to the streets because he was too exhausted to fight for him. You started running with Marcus Chen's crew when you were 17, Henry said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Stephen nodded. He gave me what I was looking for, belonging, purpose, money to help you, even though you wouldn't take it. He saw potential in me. He saw someone he could use. Henry corrected bitterly. Maybe, Stephen admitted, but he also taught me how to survive, how to command respect, how to build something that couldn't be taken away by hospital bills or landlords or bad luck. And what did it cost you? Henry asked. Your soul? Your future? Any chance at a normal life? Stephen's laugh was dark and humorless. Normal? Dad, we were never going to have normal. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with bullet holes in the walls. I watched you choose between buying groceries and paying rent. Normal was never an option for people like us. So you chose this instead. I chose to never be powerless again, Stephen said, his voice hard. I chose to make sure no one could ever take from me what the world took from you. And yeah, I made choices that hurt you. I became someone you couldn't recognize. But I survived, Dad. And I made sure everyone connected to me survived too. Henry was quiet for a long moment, processing words he'd waited 7 years to hear. When did you take over from Chen? 4 years ago, Stephen said. He was getting sloppy, making enemies he couldn't afford. I saw where it was heading, so I made a move. You killed him. It wasn't a question. Stephen's silence was answer enough. Henry closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that truth settle over him like a shroud. This was his son, his boy, who used to cry over injured birds, who used to help elderly neighbors carry their groceries, who used to have nightmares and crawl into Henry's bed for comfort. That boy had killed a man to take his throne. "I don't expect you to understand," Stephen said quietly. "I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that everything I did, every choice I made, I did it believing I was protecting what mattered, including you. By staying away from me?" "Yes," Stephen said firmly. "My world is dangerous, Dad. The people I deal with don't have boundaries, don't have mercy. If they knew you were my weakness, they would have used you against me. So I stayed away. I built walls. I made sure no one knew that the infamous Stephen Curtis had an 81-year-old father living alone in Ridgewood." "And how's that working out?" Henry asked, gesturing to his bruised face with bitter irony. Stephen's expression darkened. "That was random. Bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. Or maybe," Henry said slowly, "it was the universe telling us that we can't keep running from each other. That 7 years is long enough to punish ourselves for choices we can't take back." Stephen looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw the toll those years had taken. The deeper lines, the grayer hair, the way his hands shook more than they used to. Henry was 81 years old. How many mornings did he have left? How many chances would Stephen get to sit across from him like this? "I'm sorry," Stephen said, and the words came out raw and broken. "For everything. For the life I chose. For breaking your heart. For staying away when I should have been here." "I'm sorry, Dad." Henry reached across the table again, both hands this time, gripping Stephen's with surprising strength. "I'm sorry too," he whispered. "For giving up on you. For choosing my fear over my love. For making you feel like you had to face the world alone." They sat like that, hands clasped across the table, two men bound by blood and broken by circumstance, finally beginning to heal. The healing moment shattered like glass. Stephen's phone buzzed on the table, not a casual notification, but the sharp, insistent vibration of an urgent call. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted. The softness that had crept into his expression vanished, replaced by the cold, calculated mask of a man who dealt in violence and consequences. "What is it?" Henry asked, recognizing the change immediately. Stephen held up one finger, answering the call. "Talk to me." He listened, his jaw tightening with each passing second. "How many? Where?" "No, don't engage yet. I'm handling this." He ended the call and looked at his father, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "The guy who hit you, he's coming back." Henry's stomach dropped. "What?" "He left here embarrassed, ran his mouth to the wrong people, and now he's bringing friends to prove he's not afraid." Stephen stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced precision. "He'll be here in less than 2 minutes." "Stephen, let it go," Henry urged, his voice tight with worry. "You scared him off. That's enough." "No, Dad, it's not." Stephen's voice was final, absolute. He had his chance to walk away. He chose to come back. He turned toward his men at the door and made a subtle gesture, 2 fingers pointed down, then a circular motion. The 2 men moved immediately, flanking the entrance, their positions casual but strategic. Diane noticed the shift in atmosphere and approached cautiously. "Stephen, what's happening?" "Keep everyone calm," Stephen said quietly. "And stay behind the counter." She nodded, her face pale, and retreated as instructed. Henry tried to stand, but his legs felt weak beneath him. "This is my fault. If I hadn't stared at him." "Stop," Stephen interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "You did nothing wrong. You sat in your booth, drank your coffee, and existed. That's not a crime, and it sure as hell isn't something you should apologize for." Through the diner's wide windows, movement caught Henry's attention. 3 figures were approaching the thug from earlier, now flanked by 2 others, both bigger, both meaner looking. One carried something in his jacket that created an unnatural bulge. The other cracked his knuckles as he walked, his stride full of aggressive confidence. The customers who had started to relax were now frozen again, sensing the approaching storm. Stephen walked toward the door with unhurried steps, meeting his men near the entrance. He spoke to them in low tones, his words inaudible to the rest of the diner, but his men nodded in understanding. The door swung open, and the 3 men entered. The original thug, the one who had slapped Henry, walked in with renewed bravado. His 2 companions looked like they'd spent more time in prison than out of it, scarred knuckles, cold eyes, bodies built for inflicting damage. "You thought you could embarrass me?" the thug called out, his voice loud and aggressive, trying to reclaim the power he'd lost an hour earlier. "You thought I'd just run away and forget about it?" Stephen stood motionless, his hands at his sides, his expression betraying nothing. "I brought my boys," the thug continued, gesturing to his companions. "And we're here to settle things proper. Old man's gonna apologize for staring, and you're gonna apologize for disrespecting me in front of all these people." A dangerous smile touched Stephen's lips, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that made smart people run in the opposite direction. "You have 10 seconds to turn around and leave," Stephen said calmly. The thug laughed, looking to his friends for validation. "You hear this guy? Thinks he's tough because he's got 2 bodyguards. 8 seconds," Stephen continued, his voice never rising. One of the companion thugs stepped forward, pulling back his jacket to reveal a gun tucked into his waistband, not drawing it, just showing it, making a point. Stephen's men didn't react. They simply stood there, utterly still, utterly calm. 5 seconds. "We ain't scared of you," the original thug spat. "I don't care who you think you are." 3 seconds. The companion with the gun reached for it. He never got his hand around the grip. Stephen's men moved with practiced, lethal precision, not fast, not flashy, but with the efficiency of professionals who had done this 1,000 times before. One of them intercepted the armed thug's hand, twisting his wrist at an angle that made the man's knees buckle. The gun clattered to the floor, kicked away in the same motion. The other companion swung wildly, his fist cutting through empty air as Stephen's second man sidestepped and delivered a precise strike to the man's solar plexus, dropping him to the floor, gasping for air. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. The original thug stood frozen, his bravado evaporating as he realized he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Stephen walked forward slowly, stopping directly in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone in the diner heard it clearly. "You just threatened my father." Again. The thug's face drained of color. "You came into his sanctuary," Stephen continued. "You brought weapons. You brought friends who thought they could intimidate an 81-year-old veteran." He leaned in closer. "Do you understand what you've done?" The thug tried to speak, but no words came out. Stephen glanced at his men. "Make sure they understand that if they ever, and I mean ever, come within sight of this diner again, we're not going to have a conversation." His men nodded. Stephen turned back to his father, who sat in the booth watching with a mixture of fear and something else, something that might have been pride. "It's over, Dad," Stephen said quietly. "I promise." The 3 men were escorted out of the diner by Stephen's crew, not violently, but firmly, with the kind of professional efficiency that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. The gun remained on the floor until one of Stephen's men picked it up with a napkin, checked it, and slipped it into his jacket with the casual ease of someone who'd handled firearms more times than he could count. The door closed behind them, and the bell chimed its innocent little jingle, as if violence hadn't just been narrowly avoided in a small-town breakfast spot. Stephen stood in the center of the diner for a moment, his back to his father, his shoulders tense. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back to the booth where Henry sat, his coffee long cold, his breakfast untouched, his face reflecting a complicated storm of emotions. Stephen slid back into the seat across from him, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. "You didn't have to do that," Henry said finally, his voice quiet. "Yes, I did," Stephen replied without hesitation. "Violence isn't always the answer, son." "It wasn't violence, Dad. It was prevention." Stephen's eyes were steady, calm. "Those men came here armed, with intent. If I'd let them walk in here and make demands, if I'd shown even a second of weakness, this place would have become a target. Not just for them, but for everyone who thinks they can push people around without consequences." Henry wanted to argue, wanted to tell Stephen that there were other ways, better ways. But looking at his son, this man who commanded respect through presence alone, who had just diffused a potentially deadly situation without firing a shot or throwing a punch, he realized something uncomfortable. Stephen was good at this. Whatever moral lines he'd crossed, whatever choices had led him down this path, he had become extraordinarily competent at protecting what mattered to him. "When did you get so calm?" Henry asked. "You used to be all fire and fury, hot-headed, quick to fight." A ghost of a smile touched Stephen's lips. "I learned that the loudest man in the room is usually the weakest. Real power doesn't need to announce itself." "Who taught you that?" "You did," Stephen said, and the answer clearly surprised Henry. "You remember that night when I was 14? Those guys from the high school football team were harassing that kid with the limp?" Henry nodded slowly. "Marcus. Sweet kid. They used to push him around every day after school. I wanted to fight them," Stephen continued. "All 5 of them. I was ready to get my face smashed in if it meant they'd leave him alone. But you stopped me. You walked right up to those boys, didn't raise your voice once, and you said—" He paused, remembering. Real men don't prove their strength by hurting people weaker than them. Real men protect. And if I see you bothering this boy again, you'll find out exactly what kind of man I am. Henry remembered. He'd been younger then, stronger, his hands steady. The football players had seen something in his eyes, something that came from years of military service, from staring down actual enemies, and they'd backed off. Marcus was never bothered again. They listened because you didn't need to shout, Stephen said. You didn't need to swing first. You just were. And that was enough. He leaned forward. I spent years trying to be that, trying to have that kind of presence, and somewhere along the way, I realized I'd become it just in a world you never wanted me to be part of. Henry's throat tightened. I'm proud of the man you are, Stephen. I'm heartbroken about the life you lead. I know, Stephen said simply. And I wish I could tell you I'm going to walk away from it, change everything, become someone you can be proud of without reservations. But I can't lie to you, Dad. This is who I am. This is the life I've built. And there are people, good people, who depend on me. Good people in a bad business. Good people trying to survive in a world that doesn't give people like us many options. Stephen corrected gently. I employ over 200 people, Dad. Most of them have records. Most of them couldn't get legitimate jobs if they tried. I give them structure, income, protection. I make sure their kids have food and their rent gets paid. By breaking the law. By filling the gaps the law ignores, Stephen countered. I'm not saying I'm a hero. I'm not delusional. But I'm not a monster either. I have rules. Lines I don't cross. People I protect. Henry studied his son's face, the tattoos, the expensive suit, the hardness that came from years of making impossible choices. And beneath it all, he still saw the boy who had cried at his mother's funeral, who had held Henry's hand during the hardest years of their lives, who had always protected people weaker than himself. I can't condone what you do, Henry said finally. I can't pretend I'm okay with it. I'm not asking you to. But I can't lose you again either, Henry continued, his voice cracking. These past 7 years, Stephen, I've been dying slowly. Not from age, not from sickness, but from not knowing if my son was alive or dead, from wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life by pushing you away. Stephen's composure cracked, his eyes reddened, and he looked away quickly, his jaw clenched tight against emotion he'd spent years learning to suppress. I thought about calling you 1,000 times, Stephen admitted, his voice rough. I'd pull up your number, stare at it for an hour, and then convince myself you were better off without me, that my life would only bring you pain. And look where that got us, Henry said with a bitter smile, touching his bruised cheek. Maybe if you'd been around, that kid wouldn't have had the nerve to touch me in the first place. That's never happening again, Stephen said firmly. I don't care if you want me here or not. I'm not letting you sit in this diner alone anymore. I'm not letting you be vulnerable to every punk who thinks he can take out his frustrations on an old man. I'm not that old, Henry protested weakly. Dad, you're 81. I can still take care of myself. I know you can, Stephen said, reaching across the table to grip his father's trembling hand. But you shouldn't have to. Not anymore. Not when you have a son who can make sure you never have to worry about anything again. Tears rolled down Henry's weathered cheeks, tears he didn't bother wiping away. I've missed you so much, he whispered. I've missed you too, Dad, Stephen replied, his own voice breaking. Every single day. They sat like that, hands clasped across the table. Two broken men slowly finding their way back to each other through the wreckage of years lost and choices made. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Inside the Ridgewood diner, a father and son began the long, difficult work of rebuilding what had been shattered. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be clean. But it would be real. And sometimes, that was enough. 1 week later, the Ridgewood diner looked exactly the same as it always had: red vinyl booths, checkered floor, the smell of coffee and bacon hanging in the air like a familiar embrace. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the place, something the regular customers could feel even if they couldn't quite articulate it. Henry Curtis still arrived every morning at 8:10, rain or shine. But now, when he walked through the door, he wasn't alone. Stephen had started showing up 5 minutes earlier, already seated in the corner booth, 2 cups of black coffee waiting, one for himself, one for his father. He wore slightly more casual clothes now, though still expensive. Dark jeans, a pressed shirt, a leather jacket that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His tattoos were still visible, crawling up his neck like permanent reminders of the life he'd chosen. But his expression had softened somehow, the hard edges worn down by daily proximity to the one person who had ever truly known him. On this particular morning, Henry walked in to find Stephen already reading the newspaper, his coffee steaming gently in front of him. "You're early," Henry said, sliding into the booth with a small smile. "Couldn't sleep," Stephen replied, folding the paper and setting it aside. "Figured I might as well be useful." Diane appeared almost immediately, her smile genuine and warm. She'd gotten used to Stephen's presence over the past week, had stopped flinching every time his men walked through the door. "Morning, gentlemen. The usual?" "Please," Henry said. "Make it 2, Stephen added. She nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen, leaving father and son in comfortable silence. The other customers had adjusted too. The initial fear and whispered speculation had given way to cautious acceptance. Stephen Curtis feared Mafia boss. Ruthless enforcer, came to the Ridgewood diner every morning to have breakfast with his elderly father. He was polite to the staff, never caused trouble, and tipped so generously that Diane had been able to fix her car and pay off a credit card. His men, usually 2 of them, sat at a separate table near the window. They ordered their own food, kept to themselves, and maintained a watchful but non-threatening presence. They'd become part of the scenery silent guardians that no one acknowledged but everyone noticed. "How's business?" Henry asked, the question still feeling strange in his mouth. He'd spent years refusing to acknowledge Stephen's work, and now here he was, asking about it like it was a normal job. "Complicated," Stephen said carefully. "There's some territorial tension on the east side. Nothing I can't handle, but it requires attention." "Dangerous attention?" "It's all dangerous, Dad," Stephen said honestly. "But I've got good people, smart people. We'll manage it." Henry nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. He still didn't approve, probably never would, but he'd made a conscious choice over the past week. He could either spend whatever time he had left pushing Stephen away because of moral disagreements, or he could accept his son as he was and be grateful for the relationship they were rebuilding. He'd chosen the latter. "I have a doctor's appointment next Tuesday," Henry mentioned casually. "Annual checkup." Stephen's attention sharpened immediately. "What time?" 10 in the morning. "I'll drive you." "You don't have to." "Dad," Stephen interrupted gently. "I'm driving you." End of discussion. Henry smiled despite himself. Some things never changed. Stephen had always been stubborn, even as a child. Diane returned with 2 plates of eggs, bacon, and toast, setting them down with practiced efficiency. "Anything else, boys?" "We're good, thank you," Stephen said, and she left them to their meal. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the simple act of sharing a meal together feeling both familiar and miraculous. 7 years of separation, and now they were here, breaking bread like the lost time had been only a brief interruption. "People treat me differently now," Henry said eventually, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. "How so?" "With respect," Henry clarified. "Like I matter. Mrs. Peterson from down the street, she used to barely acknowledge me. Now she stops to chat every time she sees me. The kid who bags groceries carries them to my car without being asked. Even the landlord fixed my leaky faucet within a day of me mentioning it." Stephen's expression remained neutral. "Good. It's because of you," Henry continued. "They know you're my son. They know what that means. Does that bother you?" Henry considered the question carefully. "It should," he admitted. "Getting respect because people are afraid of my son's reputation should bother me. But honestly, at 81, after years of being invisible, of being just another old man people talk over and ignore, it's nice to be seen again." "You were always worth seeing," Stephen said quietly. "The world just needed reminding." "By intimidation." "By presence," Stephen corrected. "I haven't threatened anyone. I haven't hurt anyone. I just exist in your orbit now, and people understand that touching you means dealing with me. That's not intimidation, Dad. That's protection." Henry wanted to argue the semantics, but he was too tired and, truthfully, too grateful. For the first time in years, he felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally. He had his son back, and whatever moral compromises that required, he'd decided they were worth it. "Your mother would have complicated feelings about all this," Henry said with a sad smile. Stephen's expression softened at the mention of Sarah. "She'd be disappointed in my choices, but proud of you coming back," Henry added. "She always said family was everything. That blood wasn't just biology, it was commitment." I'm committed now, Stephen said firmly. I'm not disappearing again, Dad. I don't care what happens, what complications arise. You're not facing the world alone anymore. Henry's eyes misted over. Thank you, son. They finished their breakfast as the diner filled with its usual morning crowd, construction workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, elderly couples sharing quiet meals, a few high school students stopping in before class. And in the corner booth, a father and son who had been torn apart by circumstance and choice sat together, rebuilding their bond one breakfast at a time. Stephen's phone buzzed, it always did, the demands of his world never fully silenced, but he glanced at it and set it aside without responding. Business? Henry asked. Nothing that can't wait, Stephen replied. I'm with my father. Everything else comes second. And in that moment, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the gentle murmur of morning conversation, Henry Curtis felt something he hadn't felt in 7 long years. He felt whole. 3 months later, the Ridgewood Diner had become more than just a breakfast spot. It had transformed into something sacred, a neutral ground where the outside world's complications dissolved, where a mafia boss could be just a son, and where an elderly veteran could reclaim the dignity that age and circumstance had tried to steal. Henry still arrived at 8:10. Stephen still arrived at 8:05. And every single morning, without fail, they sat in that corner booth and shared coffee, breakfast, and conversation that ranged from mundane to profound. On this particular morning in late autumn, golden light streamed through the windows, catching on the chrome edges of the tables and making the whole diner glow with warmth. Henry walked in with steadier steps than he'd had 3 months ago, not because his body had grown younger, but because his spirit had grown lighter. Stephen was already there, of course, the newspaper folded beside him, 2 steaming cups of coffee waiting. Morning, Dad, he said with a smile that reached his eyes now, the hardness that had defined him for so long softening around the edges. Morning, son, Henry replied, sliding into his seat with the ease of routine. Diane didn't even need to ask anymore. She simply brought out their usual orders: eggs over easy for Henry, scrambled for Stephen, bacon for both, extra toast. You boys are too predictable, she teased gently. Predictable is underrated, Stephen replied with a grin. She laughed and left them alone, moving to attend to other customers who had also grown accustomed to the daily sight of the Curtis men in their corner booth. Henry looked at his son, really looked at him, and marveled at the changes 3 months had wrought. Stephen still dressed well, still carried himself with that commanding presence, still had men positioned strategically throughout the diner for protection. But something essential had shifted. The tension that had coiled through his body like a spring had loosened. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, looked less like a man constantly preparing for war, and more like a man who had found something worth living for beyond survival and power. I saw Dr. Morrison yesterday, Henry said casually, buttering his toast. Stephen's attention sharpened immediately, concern flickering across his face. The checkup we talked about? The very one. And, Henry drew out the word, enjoying the rare opportunity to make his unflappable son visibly nervous. He said, I'm in surprisingly good health for a man my age. Blood pressure's better than it was 6 months ago. Heart sounds strong. He actually seemed impressed. The relief on Stephen's face was palpable. That's great, Dad. Really great. He asked what I'd changed, Henry continued. I told him I'd reconnected with my son, started eating regular meals again, had something to look forward to every morning. He paused, his voice growing softer. He said emotional health affects physical health more than people realize. That loneliness kills. Stephen set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. You were lonely. It wasn't a question. For 7 years, Henry admitted. I had acquaintances, people I'd say hello to, but no one who really knew me. No one I could talk to about things that mattered. I was just existing, waiting for time to run out. I'm so sorry. Stop, Henry interrupted gently. We've apologized enough. Both of us made choices. Both of us suffered for them. But we're here now, and that's what matters. Stephen nodded, but guilt still shadowed his eyes. Henry recognized it because he carried the same weight all the lost time, the missed moments, the years they could never reclaim. I've been thinking, Stephen said slowly, about the future. Oh? My business, Stephen clarified. The life I lead. I'm not going to pretend I can just walk away from it. There are too many people depending on me, too many obligations. But I've been making changes, shifting focus toward more legitimate operations, less risk, less violence. Henry's eyebrows rose. Because of me? Because of us, Stephen corrected. Because I finally have something more important than power or reputation. I have you, Dad. and I don't want to waste whatever time we have left by getting myself killed over territory disputes or pride. Tears pricked at Henry's eyes. That means more to me than you know. I know, Stephen said quietly, because it means the same to me. They ate in silence for a while, the comfortable kind that only comes from deep familiarity and trust. Around them, the diner buzzed with life. A young couple in the next booth over laughed about something. A construction worker at the counter joked with Diane. Stephen's men sat by the window, quietly eating their breakfast, their presence protective but no longer threatening. This had become their world, this small corner of the Ridgewood diner, where the past's wounds slowly healed and the future felt possible again. Do you remember, Henry said eventually, when you were 8 years old, and we came to this diner for the first time? Stephen's face lit with surprise. I didn't know you remembered that. I remember everything about you, Henry said simply. It was your birthday. Your mother was still alive. We didn't have much money, but we wanted to do something special. You ordered me the biggest pancake stack they had, Stephen recalled, smiling at the memory. With extra syrup and whipped cream. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. You ate the whole thing, Henry laughed, then got sick in the parking lot. Worth it, Stephen grinned. Your mother took pictures, Henry continued, his voice thick with emotion. She was so happy that day. We all were. Just a normal family, having breakfast together, making memories. Stephen's smile faded into something more contemplative. And now we're back. Different circumstances, different versions of ourselves, but still here. Still family, Henry added. Still family, Stephen echoed. The moment stretched between them, heavy with significance. This diner had witnessed the beginning of their family's happiness, the middle years when they came occasionally, the long absence after Sarah's death and their falling out, and now the rebuilding, the slow, difficult, beautiful process of becoming father and son again. I love you, Dad, Stephen said suddenly, urgently, as if the words had been building pressure inside him and finally burst free. I know I don't say it enough. I know I spent years running from it, pretending I didn't need it. But I love you. Always have. Always will. Henry reached across the table and gripped his son's hand, his scarred, tattooed, dangerous hand with both of his own trembling ones. I love you too, son. More than life itself. And I'm so proud of the man you've become, even with all the complications. Even though I'm a criminal? Even though you're human, Henry corrected gently. Flawed, complicated, trying your best in an impossible world, just like the rest of us. Stephen's eyes reddened, and a single tear rolled down his cheek, something Henry hadn't seen since his son was a child. Around them, life continued. Diane refilled coffee cups. The jukebox played an old country song. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything in warm, forgiving light. And in the corner booth, Henry Curtis and Stephen Curtis sat together, holding hands across the table, two broken pieces that had finally found their way back to each other. The diner had become their sanctuary. The place where violence had nearly torn them apart had instead become the foundation of their healing. The bruise on Henry's cheek had long since faded, but the memory of that morning remained not as a wound, but as a turning point. Welcome home, son, Henry whispered. Stephen smiled through his tears. It's good to be home, Dad. If you believe broken families deserve healing, and that stories like this can inspire someone who's hurting, please subscribe. Your support helps bring more hope into the world. And as they sat together in that corner booth, surrounded by the ordinary magic of a small-town diner, both men understood something profound. Love, real, unconditional, resilient love could survive anything, even 7 years of silence, even a life of crime, even the weight of choices that could never be undone. Because in the end, family wasn't about perfection, it was about showing up. And they had finally, after so long, shown up for each other. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.